Our scripture this day is as follows. Afterward, Jesus appeared again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias. It happened this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two other disciples were together. "I'm going out to fish," Simon Peter told them. And they said, "We'll go with you." So they went out, got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize that it was Jesus. He called out to them, "Friends, haven't you any fish?" "No," they answered, he said. "Then throw your net on the right side of the boat, and you'll find some." And when they did, they were unable to haul in the net because of the large number of fish. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved, said to Peter, "It is the Lord." And as soon as Simon Peter heard him say, "It is the Lord," he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off, and jumped into the water. The other disciples followed in the boat, towing a net full of fish, for they were not far from shore, about 100 yards. When they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals there with fish on it, and some bread. And Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish you've just caught." Simon Peter climbed aboard and dragged the net ashore. It was full of large fish, 153. But even with so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." None of the disciples dared ask him, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Lord Jesus. Jesus came, took the bread, and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. This is now the third time that Jesus appeared to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. When he had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you truly love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said. "You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Again, Jesus asked, "Simon, son of John, do you truly love me?" And he answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." The third time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt because Jesus had asked him a third time, "Do you love me?" He said, "Lord, you know all these things. You know that I love you." And Jesus said, "Feed my sheep. I tell you the truth, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted, but when you were old, you'll stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go." Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, "Follow me." In our gospel lesson today, we find the disciples are depressed and hopeless, which is a bit of a shame because Jesus has already appeared twice since the resurrection. You would think they'd be a little bit more optimistic, but their world has collapsed all around them. Their leader has been crucified. And again, this takes place a week later after the crucifixion. The disciples are still a bit confused and bewildered, trying to make sense of everything that they've seen. So they do what any intelligent person would do in those circumstances. They go fishing. I mean, you have to understand that funny movies and golf and tennis, those things weren't available at that time. So Peter announced to the other disciples, "I'm going fishing." And they all responded, "We'll go with you." So they went out in a boat on the Sea of Galilee. But that night they caught nothing. Now here comes the first lesson of this story. The disciples, some of whom were recruited personally by Jesus to be fishers of men, well, after the resurrection in this story, symbolically they're doing what they've been called to do. John wants this first century congregation to see this. After the resurrection, they go fishing. Only they fail. They don't catch a single thing. They can't do it without Jesus. Don't miss that point. They can't do it without Jesus. So who would show up but Jesus himself? And as the disciples are coming to shore, they notice a stranger standing there on the beach. And Jesus asks them, "Did you catch anything?" Which is the question that everybody asks a fisherman. And usually the answer is no. Certainly not for us, not this time. Not much happening out tonight. Things must be fished out. They fished all night and caught nothing. The stranger says, "Cast your net on the right side of the boat." They do it, and they catch a whole mess of fish. And the disciple named John says to Peter, "It's the Lord. It's got to be the Lord. He's the only one who can fish like that." But listen to this. The text says there are 153 fish in the net. Now, anytime the Bible talks about numbers specifically, there's a reason. This corresponds, incidentally, to the number of species of fish that were thought to exist in the known world at that time, 153 exactly. So John seems to be saying to this congregation that without Jesus' empowering and guiding us, we as disciples are ineffective. But we have a duty and a responsibility to preach the word to everyone, to all nations. 153 at least. Biblical faith reminds us that we are powerless apart from Jesus' presence. And that's the way the story opens. It proclaims that Jesus is truly with us. Jesus is with us to empower us and to guide us in doing what He's called us to do. But without Jesus, we're stuck. We're going to come up empty-handed. Our nets would always be empty. We can't do it without Jesus. So you could call the first part of the story the big catch of fish. The second part of the story in scene 2 could be called the charcoal fire. And this is an important part of the story that I want to focus on for just a moment. When the disciples get out of the boat and they join Jesus on the beach, Jesus is standing by a charcoal fire. Now there's a very specific reason why that detail is important. It's no ordinary fire, it's a charcoal fire. Because the last time we read about a charcoal fire is in the Gospel of John in the 18th verse, 18th chapter. It's outside the palace of Caiaphas, the high priest of Jerusalem. The soldiers are standing around a charcoal fire warming themselves. Peter is kind of lurking in the shadows. And the soldiers see his face, obviously illuminated by the fire. And they think they recognize him. And they say, Aren't you a disciple of Jesus?" And Peter says emphatically, "No, I'm not." They ask him a total of 3 times besides a charcoal fire. "Aren't you a disciple of Jesus?" "No, I'm not." "Are you sure? You sure look like that guy." "Aren't you?" "No, I've never met the man," he says. So there's Jesus standing beside this charcoal fire. And Peter right away jumped out of the boat when he saw that it was Jesus. Jesus said nothing to him. Took the fish, cooked them breakfast. Took the bread and broke it, gave it to them. Now they know. Now there's no doubt whatsoever. They know it for sure, this is the Lord. They're having communion as He promised. They would all sit at the table with Him in the kingdom when He returned, when He was Lord of all. But now look what happens. The meal, breakfast is over. And Jesus turns to Peter and asks, "Simon, do you love me?" And Peter says, "Yes, Lord, I do love you." "Then feed my lambs." A second time, "Simon, do you love me?" "Yes, Lord, I love you." "Then tend to my sheep." A third time, "Simon, do you really love me?" "Yes, Lord." "Then feed my sheep." 3 times, Peter had denied Jesus around a charcoal fire. And now 3 times, Jesus has forgiven Peter around a charcoal fire. That's what's happened there on that beach. Feed my sheep means, Peter, you've got your old job back. You are forgiven. You are loved. You are restored. Everything is put back. Forgiveness means that the past no longer has to weigh you down. Feed my sheep means that you've got a new future now. There's still a job for you to do in spite of your denial. You can put all your gifts and energy into the present and the future and forget about the past. All is good. And I believe that's the meaning of the charcoal fire. In a sense, there is forgiveness. There is a resurrection gospel there for all of us. But there's one more issue. This story ends with a riddle. It's one of the very few times that Jesus uses a riddle, but Jesus says to Peter, when you were young, you girded yourself and walked where you would. But when you were old, you'll stretch out your hand, and another will gird you, will carry you where you do not wish to go. What does that mean? Well, John's interpretation on the riddle is this. He says it's a prediction of Peter's crucifixion. That Peter is going to die like Jesus on the cross. But there's something else. Look at the riddle again. When you were young, you helped yourself and walked where you would, but when you're old, you'll stretch out your hand, and another will gird you, will help you. See, there's a time in all of our lives, like Peter, when we think we can do anything. Like we are in complete charge of the universe, master of our domain. And then sooner or later we fail. Fall flat on our faces. And it's humiliating. It's embarrassing. It's frustrating. We've learned that we can't do it all. We're not in charge, and we're not nearly as big and tall and bulletproof as we once thought we were. We need someone else. We need someone's forgiveness, maybe. We need someone's patience. We need someone's grace. Someone's knowledge or wisdom. We need the healing touch of a physician or a nurse or a caring orderly. Or maybe it's just someone else's prayers. That's the way it was with the disciples. Back in 1992, in the Olympics in Barcelona, Spain, in the 400-meter race, Derek Redmond, the sprinter from Great Britain, rounded the curve. And all of a sudden, in the middle of this race, in the middle of the Olympics, of all these people watching around the world, he falls. He lays on the track holding his thigh. He's torn his hamstring muscle. And he started to inch along toward the finish line. Even though he's lost the race, he's still moving towards the goal. He could barely move. The officials, in fact, come out and they surround him, trying to help him up and off the track. But he insisted on finishing the race. Just then, a man comes out of the stands. It was Derek Redmond's father. He put his hand out to his son and helped him up. That father girded his son, strengthened him, and leaning on his father's arm, they finished the race. And afterwards, a reporter asked the father, "Why did you do that? Why did you bother to come out of the stands? I mean, he's lost. There's no way. What's the point?" And he said, "We started this together. We're going to finish it together." The disciples are in that boat fishing, having a miserable time, not catching a thing. If you've ever been fishing, especially all night, and not catch a thing, you're not having a good time. And a stranger on the shore tells them where to find the fish. They couldn't do it on their own. Then he renews the life that he'd given them years before. He gives their lives back to them. He helps them understand what their purpose is. They know they couldn't have done it by themselves or couldn't have done it without Jesus. But because he started with them, he finished with them. And I just wonder, is there a message in this story for anyone here this morning? Is there a message in this story for this congregation? I hope so. Will you join me in prayer?